What did monks sip before dawn to open the inner eye? That question sits like steam above a small cup, part curiosity, part projection. It is easy to imagine a secret ingredient, a single herb that makes memory bloom and visions arrive. Yet the story we will travel together is subtler. It moves between manuscripts hidden in sand, cosmologies that treat forgetfulness as the human condition, and simple somatic cues that monastic communities use to remind themselves who they were. When I use the phrase pineal gland in this conversation, hear it first as a poetic shorthand, a Western image for the subtle center of inner attention, not as a physiological claim or a prescription. What follows is an exploration of history, body, and metaphor, offered with scholarly caution and practical gentleness. In 1945, in the deserts near Nag Hammadi, a farmer's shovel turned up a buried library. Sealed pottery jars contained texts that had not been read for many centuries, treatises, dialogues, poems that would come to be labeled Gnostic by modern scholars. These manuscripts are not a single book, but a collage of voices from diverse communities. Some groups called themselves pneumatic, from the Greek for spirit, and they prized direct, inward experience of the divine as a path to remembrance, or anamnesis. That recollection is the heart of what those texts sought, not information, but the recovery of an origin that feels obscured by the noise of daily life. Scholars still debate authorship, dating, and interpretation. What is clear is that these writings reflect a spiritual concern with remembering and with the practices that help memory return. If you want the rest of this series, practical activations plus historical deep dives, subscribe now. To make sense of why the search for memory matters in these texts, it helps to sketch a simple cosmology they often assume. Imagine a clear mountain spring that feeds a wide lake. In some Gnostic stories, the original source, sometimes called the monad, is like that high spring, simple, luminous, unfragmented. At some point, through metaphor or myth, the water of that spring disperses. Creation is described as a descent or fall. Between the source and everyday consciousness, intermediary beings appear, demiurgic figures and lesser powers, sometimes called archons, and they are described as obscuring the clarity of the original light. Think of the archons as silt and reeds stirring at the bottom of the lake so that the reflection of the mountains becomes dim. The task of spiritual practice in that imagination is not to invent a new light, but to clear the water enough that the original reflection can be seen again. Anamnesis, the recollection of origin. This is a working metaphor, instructive, poetic, interpretive, not a doctrine that replaces other Christian claims. Many early Christians did not share this cosmology. It is one thread among many in the tapestry of late antique spirituality. If the problem is obscured reflection, how did communities attend to memory in practical, embodied ways? Among the practical measures emphasized in varied monastic and pneumatic contexts were small, repeatable bodily signs, what some sources and later commentators call marks or points of attention. 3 such places became common as experiential anchors: the nape at the base of the skull, the outer edge of the hand near the little finger, and the center of the sternum where the heart finds a natural rest. None of these points are magical in themselves. They are occasions for attention, sensors on the body's compass, used to orient the mind toward recollection. The nape can be a site of grounding, a place where the weight of the neck meets the head and where one can sense support. The outer hand edge is a periphery, a border of the self that registers small contacts with the world. The sternum, centered at the chest, has long been associated across cultures with intention and command, the place where a vow feels anchored. Words alone can flatten these ideas, so let us try a gentle, safe somatic check you can do now or later, sitting comfortably. This is not a guarantee of any particular experience. It is an invitation to notice. Find a chair or cushion where your back can be supported without strain. Allow your feet to rest on the floor if that feels natural. Soften your gaze or close your eyes if that is comfortable. Let your breathing remain natural, There is no need to change it. Begin by bringing your attention to the base of your skull, the nape. Place the back of your hand lightly there, or simply bring attention without touch. Notice any temperature, subtle pressure, or the way the neck meets the head. If touch is used, keep it gentle. No pressure, no pulling, only contact that feels safe and easy. Stay with this for a few breaths. If anything feels sharp, odd, or uncomfortable, remove your hand and rest. Next, relax your arm and widen your awareness to the outer edge of your hand, just below the little finger. You can trace this line with the thumb of the other hand or simply direct attention to it. Notice the skin, the small ridges, the boundary that separates palm from world, a place of reception and of margin. Does the attention there change your sense of your hand's edges? Do textures or temperature come into focus? Attend without expectation. The aim is not to force a sensation, but to practice registering small, honest details. Finally, bring your hand, if you wish, lightly to the center of your chest, over the sternum. Or, if you prefer, allow attention to rest there without touch. Imagine a simple orienting phrase that you can repeat silently, such as, "I remember the source," or "I open to light." Say this once or twice, gently, as if testing a key in a door rather than turning it forcefully. Notice whether this phrase alters the quality of attention. Does the breath slow? Does a feeling of steadiness emerge? Again, if any movement feels uncomfortable at any time, stop and return to resting and breathing. There is no right result. The practice is a sensory-motor experiment, small cues for attention, a supportive scaffold for remembering. These somatic marks and the brief orienting phrase reflect a broader habit found among many contemplatives: the use of repeated bodily gestures and words to frame attention. In the monastic tradition more widely, pre-dawn routines, prostrations, the tasting of bitter herbs, or the inhaling of an aromatic steam were part of a culture of vigilance. Historically, communities used simple hot infusions, bitter decoctions, and aromatic resins as practical supports for wakefulness and focus, cultural tools that shaped the senses and ritualized the hour before prayer. Imagine a monk named Amun, an illustrative figure. Amun rises before dawn, not in search of a potion, but to enter a rhythm. He cradles a small cup whose steam is sharp and bitter, and the taste, the warmth in his hands, the sound of the kettle, all of these are part of a ritual that prepares his attention. The cup structures the moment. It is a signal that a space of recollection is beginning. It is important to underline that we do not have a single, authoritative recipe from the deserts. What survives are scattered mentions and varied practices, embedded in particular places and times. Describing a mon is a vignette meant to help imagine how ritual and sensory habit can scaffold attention. It is not a historical photograph. When modern readers ask, "What did monks drink to expand consciousness?" they may be looking for a chemical key. But the historical evidence and careful scholarship point toward a different conclusion. The drink is best understood as part of a wider spiritual diet. By that I mean an organized set of practices that nourish the faculties of attention, memory, and imagination. This diet includes breathwork, simple awareness of breathing, ritual touch, hand to nape, hand to chest, oriented speech or mantra, short phrases that frame intent, patterned time, pre-dawn vigils, repeated liturgy, and communal support, shared language and practices that keep one honest. These elements act together like a meal rather than an isolated ingredient. Each supports the other in forming a steady habit of attention. To speak of the pineal gland here is to use a long-standing esoteric image, a small central seat for interior sight. In Western esoteric literature and in some modern popular thought, the pineal has been cast as a symbol for the capacity to perceive inwardly. I repeat the caution. Invoking the pineal as metaphor should not be read as a medical assertion that any practice will change its biology or as an endorsement of pharmacological agents. Physiological claims are outside the scope of this conversation. Think instead of the pineal image as a heuristic, a convenient symbol for a behavioral center of attention where memory and receptivity meet. The spiritual diet, then, feeds that center with rhythm, sensory anchors, and communal language, rather than with a drink that alters chemistry. There are practical reasons why ritual beverages and aromatics appeared across cultures. The warmth of a drink in cold pre-dawn hours can sharpen awareness by simple thermoregulatory effect. A bitter taste engages the nervous system's attention. Aromatic resins carry scents that cue memory and create associative links between environment and inner state. Whatever the sensory mechanics, their use was cultural. They framed a moment as distinct from ordinary time and helped communities enter a disciplined posture. Those who study these traditions emphasize restraint in interpreting such practices. The sources are fragmentary. Later commentators sometimes project ideas back onto earlier practices. Responsible reading recognizes both the imaginative vigor of these communities and the limits of our certainty. What then does a spiritual diet look like in practice, for you who may be curious? Begin with modesty and patience. The aim is not spectacular visions but small recoveries. Clearer attention, steadier presence, softer memory. A practical starting point is to structure a very short sequence each morning for a week, and observe without expectation. Sit in a supportive posture, place attention at the 3 marks described earlier, spending perhaps 30 seconds at each. Introduce your orienting phrase quietly at the sternum. Close the sequence with a breath of gratitude or steadiness. Keep a simple log. One line noting whether the practice was easy, distracting, calming, or provoking. Over days, patterns often emerge. Certain senses or words anchor attention better than others for certain people. Share findings modestly with a community if you have one, using the language of exploration rather than certainty. A word about ethics and safety. Do not take this as an endorsement to experiment with psychoactive substances, and do not seek chemical shortcuts to inner states. Avoid any practice that risks your health or well-being. If you are under care for physical or mental health conditions, consult a knowledgeable professional before experimenting with new spiritual practices. Additionally, when reading Gnostic and pneumatic texts, hold a hermeneutic of humility. These writings offer rich, sometimes corrosive, images and claims about cosmology and salvation. They can illuminate aspects of late antique spirituality, but do not constitute a single unified revelation that supersedes canonical traditions. Appreciate their contribution as one strand among many in the history of Christian thought. There is another layer worth noting: community. Practices of remembrance are not only individual experiments, they make sense when shared. The pneumatic communities and monastic groups built smaller architectures of meaning, common phrases, agreed marks, ritual cues, that allowed members to check and compare experiences. If you try the short somatic check above and notice a small shift, a tightening, a softening, you might consider sharing a brief note in a community space. If you do, use the single keyword, recognition, and add one line about what you noticed. Short reports are more useful than long interpretations. They help a group to map patterns without creating hierarchies of experience. Before we close, let us return to the image of the lake. Memory in this metaphor is the lake's clear reflection of the source. Archons and debris are not villains in a modern moral sense, but metaphors for the myriad forces, habit, distraction, fear, social conditioning, that stir the water and dim the image. The spiritual diet we have been describing is less about overthrowing those forces, and more about learning to still the lake for a long enough moment that a truthful reflection can be perceived. The practice is about cultivating the capacity to notice, to hold attention steadily, and to let recollection arise without coercion. That is the real opening the ancients sought. If this conversation has stirred something in you, and if you try the practice, please write recognition in the comments followed by a single line about what you noticed. There is no need to report visions or definitive proof, only honest, modest testimony of attention. Subscribe if you would like to continue with this series. Future episodes will offer deeper historical context, careful readings of particular texts, and other gentle activations for attention and memory. Imagine, finally, a cup at dawn. Steam lifting, the cup warm in 2 hands, the room hushed. The real intake is not what is sipped, but what the cup signals, the stopping, the posture, the willingness to be remembered. Let that image be your closing companion, small, ordinary, and quietly demanding. In time, with restraint and community, the lake may still enough for reflection. Remember that every practice must be entered with care and ended with compassion for yourself and others. If you walk this path, walk gently and in good company.